Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really delighted to have a chance to visit Tulane's campus. I was saying this is my second visit, and what a beautiful place, and I thought it would actually be a good place to begin, given this very compelling study series on sustainability and globalization, with a project that really, for I would say my whole working life, has been my inspiration. It seems to very much capture the theme of the series. This is, and maybe you've come across it, I did when I was in planning school, Hampstead Garden suburb. And in addition to what it represented at the time, and I think it began actually around 1905 in what was then the countryside outside London, has been an inspiration for me my entire career, because not only was it visionary in what it imagined and executed as far as a new type of community structure. This was farmland outside London in 1905 when it was built. It created housing of various typologies, flats and townhouses and kind of mini manor houses, and at the center is this church and that you see in the center of the photograph, and community buildings and very thoughtfully organized shops and what have you. All of the physical elements that made for a very pleasing, integrated community. I mean, someone, from Congress for New Urbanism couldn't have done a better job of actually laying out a very pleasing physical infrastructure of varied buildings and landscapes and views and facilities. But what caught my eye back in the day when I was a student was what it described almost as an afterthought of maybe because I was in planning school, it described who lived there and what had been intentionally designed in. It wasn't just people who could afford the townhomes and manor homes and the nice flats for working people, but they talked about building housing for poor seniors and for working girls and for orphans. And that notion of how we design our communities, not just for physical and environmental sustainability, but for social sustainability, with that kind of commitment to sort of radical inclusion. In some ways, I feel that our work at Common Ground and now through Community Solutions has been really pressing that idea ever since, and getting bolder in now our ways of applying these ideas of connecting physical and environmental sustainability with social sustainability, because I really don't think you can have one or two. You need all three to really have communities that hold, that last, and that frankly we want to be part of. So the three things I'm going to try to leave you with, and would hope that you press me on this if I haven't done a good job of sticking to script in the course of the description here, are three notions. One is this concept of people, buildings, and communities, and we have to really be thinking about all three at once. And that there is really a very clear case, I think, to be made based on our work. This isn't kind of just a value, it's what we've really seen matters and triggers bigger change, that you start thinking about these intersections by looking at what are the hardest problems, what are the toughest places. It's one thing to, if you've got a greenfield site outside London in 1905, to cook up a great community, but how do we take these ideas and apply them to the really broken communities in our country and the world, and use those notions to improve them? And then here's my conscience over here. Speak up, speak up. And then lastly, I want to ask you to think about an idea that we've come to, and would love to get your thoughts on whether this holds water for you, about whether housing and community building is it a product, or is it also equally a process? By that I mean not necessarily, like a zoning review board process, but how this notion of housing, gets created, it gets allocated, and how communities form. So with that as the backdrop, let me sort of walk you through the evolution of our thinking about these issues of sustainability. And can't say back in 1990 when I started Common Ground that sustainability as a concept as it's articulated now is on my mind. I think, when did we start thinking about green and sustainability using that language? Maybe 2000. But the idea of how you made a decent place out of a really horrible place and what needed to go into it was very much on my mind when we started a new not-for-profit, Common Ground, basically to take on this building. It was probably the worst building in the worst neighborhood in New York City at that time. All that being relative, Times Square still had a lot of valuable real estate back in 1990, but it was the neighborhood with the highest crime rate. It had the highest concentration of homeless individuals sleeping outside. It was basically known the world over as a place of kind of criminality, social despair, and frankly, as an icon of urban blight. And sitting in the middle of that whole large kind of failed community was this large building at that time as a 735-room, single-room occupancy hotel. It had about 1,700 building code violations. It was about to be condemned. An entire floor had been burned out. And then there were about 200 elderly and mentally ill people still living there. It was kind of like the crime magnet in Times Square, the place that, if you were about to be busted on 42nd Street, you could safely run over to the lobby at the Times Square Hotel and, find refuge. So it was a place that was just a nightmare for the neighborhood. But there were also these individuals living there who were, frankly, among the frailest and least powerful in the city when you think about it, people who had no ability to escape that scene. And it was in an area that, despite its problems, there was an active group of neighbors, property owners, the New York Times is nearby, Broadway theaters, who right about the time this building was in the news because it was now in bankruptcy, facing condemnation, the organizers of the Times Square Business Improvement District, which were these property owners, had sort of at the same time sort of given up on the idea that the city or the state of New York was somehow going to save the situation. And it pulled together in this local management group to say, what can we do ourselves? If we, you're familiar probably with business improvement districts, the fact that you add a tax to, and the formula in Times Square to, each of the property owners' tax bills based on the size of their buildings, and actually could create sort of a supplemental public safety and sanitation force. But more than those services on the street, I think that organization represented to me something that was pretty radical, which is the idea of kind of a community taking ownership of its future and not waiting for government action. And so when I had this idea that someone should save the Times Square Hotel and kind of wrote it up, and to my surprise got a lot of interest in the idea that I proposed, which was to take this mess of a building and turn it into something that would be really a symbol of how we could solve the problem of homelessness rather than just kind of manage the pieces around. I mean, you're probably familiar with what happens in most cities with the homeless. Cities open a shelter and closes in the morning, and people wander the streets by day, and most people don't see the reality that people who are homeless are in the emergency room a lot and in jails a lot and die a lot earlier than most people who aren't homeless. But that visible part of homelessness we all associated with sort of non-housing, with kind of an institution like a shelter, certainly not any kind of solution, but just a temporary fix. Well, I'd had the great good fortune, my first job after college, after I'd spent a year volunteering at a shelter for runaway kids, I just got sort of obsessed with housing and it got to be a better way than just opening shelters, and had a chance to work on some of the first projects in New York City actually those turned out to be the first projects in the country that combined social services, the support for people who were socially isolated and without any kind of networks would need to get back on track, like healthcare support and mental health support and a job, combining those services with providing affordable housing. And so I'd worked on some of the first projects and kind of saw their strengths and their limitations. We were building them all for just homeless people, and it was sort of becoming an institutional type of environment again. And we were building them in really kind of isolated neighborhoods that were very far from jobs, and that was a frustration for the tenants once they moved in. They wanted to get a life back together. And so when I saw the Times Square Hotel, I was like, hey, this idea that we've been trying out on a smaller scale, you could do something really dramatically different here. You could incorporate the formerly homeless and this notion of stable housing linked to support, and also create affordable housing for people who live and work in Times Square, because even at its worst, you had all those Broadway theaters and a very active arts community, and even in 1990, artists were still looking for more affordable housing. And so proposed to create this mixed income model that would incorporate turning the commercial spaces, which were then kind of like a rundown deli and a tchotchke shop, into businesses that would employ tenants of the building, and turn the building itself into small studio apartments that people would pay on the basis of income, about 30% of income, and that it would just follow this radical integration idea that just half of the building would be for formerly homeless tenants. Those original tenants would get to stay, and then the remaining units would be for lower-income working people, particularly those working in the arts. And I think it was just such a sort of a practical idea, and the city and the neighborhood were feeling desperate enough about the building that they were like, okay, don't have any other ideas for this one. So that was the beginning of the Common Ground story and the beginning of our work. So we were able to buy the building, which was in this kind of shape, and over the course of a 3-year renovation period, turn it into that whole concept that I'd imagined, with a total of 642 units, and with half homeless, half low-income working people. And it really became quite a new step in our thinking as a community of people working on this issue of what could be done. People didn't return to homelessness. It just became a very functioning community. But the notion of starting with buildings quickly began in mine and my colleagues' mind to fade as the solution alone, because we discovered something that has also become a huge part of our understanding of the issue, which is if you don't start with people, fixing up buildings and designing housing to meet people's needs whose needs are not met by the mainstream housing market, actually is not an adequate solution alone. This is a gentleman, actually, who's kind of representing the work we now do nationally. He didn't happen to live in Times Square at the time, but when we finished the Times Square Hotel and fully rented, all of the challenges of mixing populations that people thought would present themselves never happened. But we took a look around Times Square and saw that many of the same individuals who had been there homeless before we even opened the building were still there, and realized that, wait a minute, something didn't happen just right here. We created a terrific and successful project by many measures, but we actually hadn't reached the people in the community who we thought were our principal audience. That began a journey that has really, as you'll hear, changed our understanding completely of what's at stake with homelessness and what's at stake with vulnerable people in communities. Because it's very easy to think about what transforms, the whole issue of homelessness maybe is getting better housing together. Well, what transforms homelessness is having faith in the people who are homeless themselves, that underneath all that trauma is actually a person who, given a right situation, can rediscover himself. I just think this combination of pictures is so stunning that I always like to show it, because it just is a constant reminder to us that there are housing solutions and community solutions for every individual, and that what happens when we actually get that match right is pretty incredible. So this was what Times Square as a neighborhood looked like back in 1990. Hard to believe if you've been there recently, but you can probably imagine cities that you've visited and neighborhoods here that look equally bleak. And as I kind of go through some of the steps in our journey through this issue, I just think it's also helpful to keep these old pictures in mind. Pictures of what people look like before they were had the chance to move back into homes, or what neighborhoods and buildings look like. So here's I want to make sure to stick with some of the architectural themes, since I know that that's part of the agenda here. But the Times Square Hotel, as I mentioned, was in pretty ragged shape, but it also had amazing bones. It was built in 1923. We were able, using various funding tools, including the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, to turn it really into quite a showplace. We found that creating really beautiful and comfortable public spaces was a very important part of the equation of community building. People have small self-contained studio units, private bath, kitchenette, and a single room that functions as sitting room, bedroom, and dining room. So the quality of the public spaces was something that we just instinctively grasped, and we've kind of evolved over the years to have a much, I think, stronger understanding of what those kinds of spaces should look like. But we found that people actually don't require as much space as we have typically perhaps thought in this country. That it's more the quality of the space and the access to other amenities that is important for people feeling a sustaining sense of community, and having that trade-off between an affordable rent and a small space is really one that people are much more ready to make, we find. Some of the public spaces and the common spaces that we created there and have become kind of signature parts of the buildings that we built over the years are kitchens that are sized adequately to allow cooking classes, and to allow the building staff to help tenants focus on health in terms of their nutrition. Also, all of the buildings have green roofs and roof gardens. And then having so many individuals really at a point in their life in one place where they're looking to build skills and make change, always create space for classes and for especially training on financial literacy and on the types of things that will help people build skills for the workforce. That formula of find worst building in the neighborhood and restore it, create mixed income housing, bring in the right services that help people become more independent and self-sustaining, manage the building closely, and really focus on good design has kind of been borne out over many other projects, including the second project that we did in New York, the Prince George Hotel. This had almost as checkered a history as the Times Square. It had been, at that point, vacant for 8 years when we acquired it. It had functioned as a kind of giant homeless shelter for families in the 1980s. But we were able to restore it to a 416-unit building, half for homeless individuals and half for lower-income working people. And these are just some of the public spaces. We also, the next project is worth noting for a couple of reasons, and in the context of this talk, in that it was a former YMCA, actually the original YMCA residence in New York. And just parenthetically, YMCA's are really important housing in the country. It used to be the case, maybe 100 to maybe 30, 35 years ago, that most cities had a YMCA residence where if you were a single person with limited means, you could stay there pretty inexpensively for some period of time. More people actually made their transition to urban environments than we could probably even imagine because of the presence of YMCA's offering this cheap short-term housing option and kind of a community experience, meal package, what have you. Well, the Ys started getting out of the housing business probably about 20 years ago, and that sure hasn't helped what happens with homelessness in the country. You knock that kind of housing out of the equation in communities, and you have a pretty serious problem. I'm sort of on a personal crusade to stop YMCA's from converting to luxury housing or just to getting out of the business, because I think in most communities where this housing does still exist, it's needed, and there's probably a pathway to get it into not-for-profit ownership. But here's a model that we developed as part of this kind of concern that this housing not be lost throughout the country. The Christopher is a 207-unit building. It has two components in it, which makes it also very interesting. 167 units are permanent supportive housing, half formerly homeless, half low-income working people. Same formula. Services there on site help people with health, mental health, and employment. And the services, I should say, are all voluntary. It's not like you're required to meet with a social worker in order to live here, but those services are there as kind of a permanent safety net. So people really have somebody to kind of help them through crises and see that they can pursue their goals and go as far as they can. But the other part of the building, 40 units, we set aside in one wing just to the left of the door for the first program in New York, specifically for young people aging out of foster care. If you think about it, I don't know, how anyone who's a young person really manages without parental support. I think the news tells us it's probably like age 27 before we stop relying on our parents in some way, shape, or form. But if that isn't even part of your situation when you're 18 to 21, depending on what state you're in, and you're aging out of foster care, it's kind of no wonder that so many kids in that situation end up homeless. So we started thinking with this project how you get ahead of that and create housing that's almost sort of like a dorm for kids who aren't necessarily in college, but that really mimic the permanent supportive housing, but more set up in room groups. And so this has been a really successful program for kids aging out of foster care about really helping them avoid homelessness altogether. And then the last thing I'll say about the Christopher, which we started working on in 2000 and finally opened in 2004, was this is our first green building. It was, at that point, and that's not that long ago, just considered by our funding agencies to be totally frivolous, probably crazy, that we wanted to do like green roofs and use recycled material for the floor tile and the used bamboo on the cabinets and for the woodwork. Now the same funding sources who just tortured us require it, but we're really pleased by the fact that because of this sort of idea we were playing with around sustainability, we were able to, as a not-for-profit, really start pushing some ideas out around what that could mean design-wise and in terms of building materials. Here's at the Christopher, we have a green roof, and we find also that these kind of raising these environmental issues in the buildings has been very cool and an important bridge to other people in the community. So you can see kind of across the street there's a luxury apartment building there. Those residents and the Whole Foods in the basement have sort of adopted the building. Whole Foods has employed a lot of the tenants. This lady who's working with some of the tenant gardeners, we have this completely committed group of tenant gardeners who take care of everything. This lady is the head of the Garden Society for New York. They've adopted the building. So you have people who would never, ever meet each other without these kinds of common interests and kind of pushing things environmentally in terms of social mixing and the social agenda of the buildings. Now, this is the first of the new construction buildings that we did at Common Ground, and also just again to say, it's a beautiful building, as you'll see in a minute, but this is so notable for what it has managed to accomplish, again, in terms of how communities can come together differently and problems can get solved in kind of ways that, match up with our ideals, but sometimes don't seem, entirely plausible. This was a site in downtown Brooklyn, again, kind of, in the last 10 years become quite a hot neighborhood, but it was an urban renewal site that had been just an overgrown parking lot for about 40 years. And there was an affordable housing requirement on the site, and so even though the neighborhood was getting pretty tony, there was this affordable housing requirement to deal with. Well, the developers who won the development rights from the state to purchase and build there, they came to me and asked if Common Ground could actually, if they gave us the land, could finance the building of affordable housing and help them meet their requirement. Well, it's kind of an amazing proposition when you think that what they planned to build on the site was luxury housing. And they knew very well the kind of housing that we built, that we were about helping homeless people rebuild their lives. But it wasn't necessarily, like a trick, the gift, but it was a complicated proposition because under this site, there are 4 subway tubes. If you mention in New York that you're going to build things anywhere near the subway, people just start with their stories of pity for you, because dealing with the Metropolitan Transit Authority engineers around getting anywhere close to the subways is quite a challenge. But what we were able to do is, because we had this pretty unusual proposition that we were going to build supportive housing alongside luxury housing, we got an awful lot of support. And here's how the buildings sit on the site. The blue is Schermerhorn House, the 217 unit supportive housing residence that we built. And the low kind of beige buildings are luxury townhouses, the first new townhouses built in Brooklyn, and at that point in like a generation. And then on either end of the site, those buildings haven't been built yet, but the market kind of made the developer wary after the other parts of the project opened. But they're beginning to build the next phase of luxury townhomes, and I think that condominium loft building will probably go ahead in the next 2 years. And so you really have kind of an amazing proposition, like starting out in sort of like Hampstead Garden suburb in a manner of sort of a developer, and I give all credit to the team that brought us in, saying, actually, isn't this what we like about cities? People from very, very different social backgrounds living closely together and in ways that can be mutually enhancing. And what was really important, though, in this whole notion is that we design and build a really high-quality building. Now, the townhomes that were built just behind our site won all sorts of design awards. Rogers Marble is the architect here, and sold out at actually above their original prices. So with everyone knowing full well that their rear neighbor was going to be a building housing homeless people who were being moved off the streets of downtown Brooklyn. And so this is our Schermerhorn House building, which is absolutely stunning. It was built by, designed by Polshek Partners, which has become Ennead Architects. But it's also it's not LEED certified, but green to enterprise community green community standards. You have a really beautiful channel glass facade made of recycled glass. We were able to get a lot of really cool materials into the building, with our public funders saying, well, okay, because we had to build this really complicated substructure. We had to build, I think it was like 90 piles to build a platform to cantilever the building over the subway tubes. We couldn't touch the subway tubes, so it's just amazingly complicated engineering. And it really did require that we find some lightweight material for the facade. So we were able to use this channel glass, which is absolutely gorgeous. It's a really luminescent building. But when you build new, you have even while building studio apartments, you can certainly get nicer layouts than we love the rehab projects that we did early on, but the new unit layouts are really attractive. So this was an up-and-coming neighborhood which just got better, when this terrific full block project was created. But some of the work that I've done in New York has also been about taking like the worst blocks and sites we can find and using housing that we introduce to help stabilize things. This is a site in the South Bronx, a neighborhood called the Hub. So amazing transit, and really, has been successful in terms of attracting a lot of affordable housing, but still pretty serious crime problems, and very much concentrated around this block. And so we purchased the site from another not-for-profit that hadn't been able to move forward with their plan. That's how the site lays out. And this is LEED Gold building designed by Alexander Gorlin. Just really stunning. I mean, it just immediately kind of changed the whole environment, and the everyone involved in the open air drug markets found somewhere else to go, and so it's just again been a completely transformative environment, not just for the people who live there, but for the surrounding community. And when I think of it, it's not just the building, but supportive housing has 24-hour staffing. We've got just someone there at the front desk monitoring who's coming in, but also a presence on the street. You have a full-time management staff there. Just as Jane Jacobs certainly was one of the first to observe, just having more eyes on the street helps to stabilize a community. So we have some great outdoor areas, and including the green roof. And then this is how the concierge arrangement works. It's funny, in the first project in Times Square, the neighborhood was just so rough that you couldn't not have security. And so we always tried let's consider them like the concierge, so it doesn't feel like an armed camp. Well, it just kind of got built into the model. And it wasn't until we had visitors from other countries who were not at all familiar with seeing a staff lobby that we realized, actually, it's the person sitting at that desk who kind of holds the whole environment together. Make sure that only the people who have a purpose being there are there. Is the one who's like, I haven't seen Mary in the last 2 days. And so it's that staff is really such an essential part of what can look like sort of a complicated social service model. It really isn't. It's about kind of having people minding what's going on in the community. And then just to show you, an ordinary building, but I think I put this slide in because I wanted to remind myself to point out that all of these buildings are integrated like apartment by apartment. It's not like there's a floor for the formerly homeless and a floor for actors. It's apartment by apartment, just a very normalizing environment. This is, it was alluded to in the introduction. All of these buildings, now they're capital intensive, take a few years to build, but they end up saving a boatload of money to whatever community is that they're located in. Because even if you're not, as in the case of New York City, as a city running an expensive shelter system, your hospitals, your jails, the costs of homelessness are being paid, and people are unnecessarily suffering, and taxpayers are unnecessarily spending a lot of money. It's been proven in study after study that while these are the numbers in New York, these ratios hold in whatever community you're in. If you put these numbers together for New Orleans, you'd also see that it just makes no sense not to wrestle with the housing needs of vulnerable people. And so, happily, New Orleans is wrestling with the housing needs of vulnerable people, and we're thrilled to be working here with our partner Unity of Greater New Orleans on several projects, including the renovation of the Malta Square building. The Malta Square building on Canal near Jefferson Davis. This is going to be 108 units of supportive housing, mixed income for formerly homeless and low-income working people. This was an assisted living project that didn't reopen and went into foreclosure after the floods, and we were able to, with the help of HUD and many other funders, put together a package. We're waiting for our final bits of financing now and hope that that will be underway before fall. And then, excuse me, I had thought, I think I just did I failed to include a photograph of a really wonderful other building that's about to open in New Orleans at 2222 Tulane Avenue, which Unity will be operating. It was built by HRI, and it's a 60-unit building for half formerly homeless, half lower-income working people, and the interiors are all enterprise green communities, so something to really make a point of seeing when it opens within the next few weeks. It's at 2222 Tulane Avenue. It's going to be called the Rosa Keller Building, and Martha Kegel from Unity of Greater New Orleans is here, who has been the extraordinary leader of that effort. But just wanted to show you a few other things that are again, in terms of this evolution of our thinking, and with such great leadership here in New Orleans on these questions, just some, I'll posit these next slides, both as filling out our story, showing how we've evolved these ideas of sustainability and housing as a process, but also to put some ideas in your head about some of the other housing forms that you might find interesting to consider. Now, this building here is in New York City. It's on 10th and 57th, if you're familiar with the city's geography. It was built in the late 80s as a luxury condominium and went into bankruptcy. The Actors Fund of America, which I know is active here with musicians' unions, actually bought this building. They put together a development company, bought the building, and then asked Common Ground to operate it for them. And it was an interesting challenge, because what they wanted to do was not operate a 90-unit luxury condominium building. They wanted to convert it into a 178-unit shared housing building for formerly homeless individuals with AIDS, for low-income actors, and for low-income seniors. Three constituencies that they were highly concerned with among their members and continue to be, but particularly so in the early 90s. And so the idea was, could you take these luxury apartments and turn them into places that people would have basically a lease to their bedroom and a half, a third, or a quarter of the public spaces in the apartment. And at that point, shared housing was, you think of like, well, can we get, 3 elderly ladies in Vermont to live together? It was not, there had not been much imagination around the idea of mixing groups or what it would take to do that. But this has been a phenomenally successful project. And so I think just the question it raises is, how are we using the housing we have to make room for people who have no housing at all, or who could really have richer lives, more sustainable lives, if they were in community with others and had social supports. The Aurora, I mean, like, if this works, anything will work. That we've got, people who've never lived in close proximity to each other, elderly people sharing an apartment with a formerly homeless person with AIDS, and it's all working out. It takes a lot of management, and you have to actually put a lot of education into how people resolve disputes. But it's a very promising model, I think, for people who wrestle with how we create a baseline of housing for everyone. We also were sort of obsessed with what is like the whole range of housing that's needed, not just private apartments, maybe shared units, but there are plenty of people that we have encountered over our years of working with the homeless who, at least initially, don't want an apartment, we did a pretty interesting study of interviews on the street with people who've been homeless for years, and often individuals would say, just want a place that's cheap, clean, safe, no questions asked. You don't want to have to sign a lease, don't want to have to give up all of my personal information. And what people were describing, and we actually pulled together some volunteer architects and some focus groups of homeless individuals to say, could you draw this? Could you describe? And so we had a whole series of renderings and prototypes. And what we realized, it was kind of what people were describing the need for was a humane, well-managed, clean, well-designed version of the lodging house. I don't know if you've ever come across that form, but there used to be in cities, a flop house, a lodging house, just, pay a few dollars a night and you've got a place to stay that, no one will interfere with you. Well, all of those in New York on the Bowery are kind of our iconic, kind of Skid Row in New York. Just about all of those buildings had been converted or shut down, but there were a few left, and we kind of took a leap of faith. Here we've asked all of these people for their time. We've asked them, such a kind of a raw question, like, what would help you move out of homelessness? People have told us very clearly what they're looking for. Shouldn't we try to figure this out? So we actually found this one guy, Mike Gatto, who had the Andrews House, was looking to retire, was willing to sell it to us. We took a building that had 200 cubicle units, and it was just a mess. It took us, I think, 13 dumpsters to just get the garbage out of there. Built a 3-story addition, and had a design competition that we did online, and we had 189 complete entries, and out of that created a really amazing project. It's we have, and here's a shot of it on the right. Each floor has about 17 units, and it's basically almost kind of a housing by IKEA. It's a small housing unit, which from a zoning and building standpoint is considered furniture. You can see on the upper right that the plywood doesn't go all the way to the ceiling, but there's some mesh there, and that the building and fire department finally, we badgered them for years, but they finally were like, well, if we actually considered that each floor a loft and each unit furniture, I guess this could work. It has been so amazingly well received by individuals who've been on the street, and actually head of the building department came for a tour, and he's like, we agreed to this, but people in New York are kind of excited that, even within the existing code, sometimes you can push things and show that there's innovation that's possible to help solve a problem. Well, I'm going to flip back now to, all right, so, I think you've been, realizing we're getting into all right, what more do we need by way of housing forms in order to get more people into housing? Well, we started looking at the question from the point of view of the person back in 2001. We were just frustrated that even though we were kind of making a point of telling people who were doing outreach services, we're trying to end homelessness here, we kept being told that people weren't interested in housing. And so we're thinking, we just need to build more types of housing. But then we were like, what if we just don't even understand what people's experiences are trying to get into housing? And so what we did, I hired this amazing woman who was actually an intelligence officer in the Army. She was in this dark unit, a spy. So I just kind of had given up on the folks doing outreach as far as their ability to think differently about the problem. And so this amazing woman, Becky Canis, I just said, we are making so little headway, no matter what we build, on actually reducing homelessness. What aren't we thinking about? And so she, with her assistant, went out and just started mapping who was homeless in Times Square. Started going out not 9 to 5 when most of the outreach teams were working, but from 4 to 6 a.m. when people were actually on the street waking up. And what she found by doing this very consistently for 6 weeks, she saw a whole different picture of this issue than really anyone had seen before. Every day there were from 48 to 55 people living on the streets in this 20-block area where we started. But what she found was only 18 of them were the same people every day, that actually people come in and out of homelessness, and that's something we know from the utilization records at shelters, but that there's this hardcore group that we've, as a community, come to call the chronically homeless, who remain homeless not for a night or a week, but for months and years and even a lifetime. And so what Becky was picking out was, there are people who are in some short-term emergency who, are on the street, but then they're gone the next day. But then there are those who have made the streets their home. And so once we started realizing, we're probably misfiring. If someone who's going to find his own way out of homelessness, if we're offering our next vacancy to that person, we probably need to be working with the people who are telling us that they're not interested in housing at all and persuading them to let us help them find something that will be suitable. And once we kind of flipped the thinking and went into this whole realm of who's experiencing homelessness in the most extreme way, we went from having, in 2 years, this pattern every day to one person homeless on the streets of Times Square who's now in housing in the Bronx. And the whole pattern changed. Not only did we get all of those long-term homeless individuals housed, but all of the temporary homelessness we saw, that began to disappear as well. Now you'll still see people maybe a night or a day, but now there's this response system, this whole new culture of outreach as a housing placement process that actually corrects for that and gets people plugged into emergency assistance, or if people are in a long-term state of homelessness, begins the process of working with them toward housing. And this is essentially, what was being found in other people's research, that small group, the power law of homelessness, that small group over there is the group that we in New York needed to pay attention to, and that, frankly, it's the pattern in every city, that while you want and must help people who are in a short-term crisis, you need to be focusing laser-like in terms of who you're matching with housing and who you're building housing for, that is accommodating unusual needs on that group of maybe 10 to 15% of those who are homeless, who are in that very extreme state. And so we did. We created this methodology that was very effective in Times Square. We spread it to the rest of New York City. It sort of revolutionized housing outreach and the way people thought about what was going on among homeless people living on the street. And we began sharing the methodology with other cities, and that became such built up so much momentum that we've actually turned it into the 100,000 Homes campaign that was mentioned, where we're now working with 119 cities it's by July 2014, really just change the paradigm and help communities learn how to identify and match, identify who's really in extreme homelessness and match their resources to those individuals. So very proud of the fact that Unity and New Orleans is one of the early leaders in this movement, and using this whole kind of public health methodology of identifying the most vulnerable and long-term homeless. Unity was able to move hundreds of people out of encampments and into housing. Really, it's one of the astonishing stories in the whole field of homeless services, what Unity was able to achieve just with its resolve around targeting people who were in very high levels of distress and vulnerability and matching them immediately to housing. The way it works, this whole campaign, is you train a community to basically start with a new understanding of how they need to gather data. We train communities to go out and use a survey tool that measures people's vulnerability against 8 conditions that we know from the research can kill you. And it's not like smoking. It's like kidney disease. It's like having had a cold weather injury. It's having a state of trimorbidity, which means you have a chronic health, mental health, and addiction issue. And so volunteers canvass their communities during a very structured effort over 3 mornings a week to basically create the initial registry, and then continue to retool it, and then prioritize people who are most vulnerable for the housing that the community is creating. And so it's basically about not just housing 100,000 people, which is going to be an important goal in and of itself, but it's about actually making a science out of something that's been very random, and kind of resituating this whole issue as a public health issue, not as like a criminal nuisance behavior issue. And so this is basically this whole methodology, taking what we figured out in Times Square and making it sort of accessible to communities around the country. And I'm going to wind down by just telling you how we've kind of come full circle and where we've gone in launching community solutions, which is really about kind of what are the next generation problems. And we think that certainly anyone who does this kind of work for any length of time, you really want an end game. You know, it's not just how you provide better housing and more types of housing so that everyone has a shot at living a decent life in a stable place. You want to use good tools to help make your systems rational and effective for people who count on them. But you also don't always want to be cleaning up after the damage is done. And so we've thought for years that the holy grail question in this work is how do you prevent homelessness from happening in the first place? And what can the data about who becomes homeless tell us on that question? And so we started doing things like looking at this heat map, which shows the home addresses of people in prison in New York State. And those really bright areas are the areas of very high concentrations. And we did the same thing for foster care. Where do kids enter the foster care system from? And family homelessness, where exactly is this happening? Because this whole notion of, having seen that our buildings could make such a difference if we started in really tough places and if we focused on who was in the most extreme need among the homeless. And so we figured, maybe we're onto something here. What if we looked at the neighborhoods of our city where most people who are having the experiences that lead to homelessness come from? And so we decided to take this question on and work on, in a peculiar way, these whole values around that Hampstead Garden suburb, a physical environment that's mixed and that's carefully thought out, and a social environment that works, and a real radical commitment to inclusivity. And why don't we see what we can do in one of these neighborhoods that is just like off the charts in terms of bad outcomes. So we chose that biggest cluster of red right in the right center. That's Brownsville, Brooklyn. And when we got there, we found the largest concentration of public housing in the country. There are 10 developments, New York City Housing Authority called NYCHA, 10 developments, and it's both a blessing and a curse. I mean, the city still has this public housing, which is not well maintained, but it's not a disaster either. So it's in this kind of unhappy state of, doesn't qualify for a lot of federal resources because it's not bad enough, but it's really not good enough to want to live in. But nevertheless, here's the reality. You want to figure out, where you intervene early. All of these problems are connected at their roots. And so we're like, we need solutions that connect as well. Here's another aerial. And so we focused initially on these 4 big developments, a total of 4,100 units. It's what there are 2 different typologies. There's the older one. This Brownsville Houses was built in 1948 in a 6-story brick building. And then we have these larger ones. Well, these are like a bit fanciful, but we have a whole bunch of towers and a park type drawings, buildings. And so these drawings that I'm about to show you, we started thinking, well, what if you were to just take as a given that we have these public housing units, that we're not going to destroy them, that we're going to make them better, that we're going to take the unused development rights around these buildings and actually create a wider range of housing at different income levels and community amenities, and change the landscaping. And we just kind of put that question out there, like, could it be done? And we were able to get some volunteer architects to help us really kind of calculate the floor area ratio that was available, to look at how you could insert various types of buildings, like retail in this case, how you could actually modify the existing public housing towers, make them more energy efficient and healthy, how you could take the the open space, which is now underutilized parking and garbage collection areas, and turn it into something that was productive and contributed to a healthier local food system. And they found that because there's so much underutilized development rights there, you could build from 700 to 1,000 new units of housing, which is the purple. And this is all just, not a specific plan, but just putting buildings where you could create sites. And you could essentially reconnect using a laneway system these super blocks to the surrounding grid. You could insert needed retail, and that's what those yellow sections are, and just really remake that whole neighborhood without demolishing anything or displacing anyone. And so I just want to call your attention to that site over in the lower right-hand corner, which is purple and yellow, because that's become our pilot site. And for, I guess we did this 2.5 years ago, and for a while, and I think we've kind of gotten used to this, going around to NYCHA and other city agencies, people thinking that, like we're totally insane, like who are you to come in with a plan for our buildings? But, people do get it in government circles that, the failures of these neighborhoods, lives are ruined and society is paying for them downstream all the time. And so we've gradually been getting an interesting hearing, and we've focused on this set of buildings in this development called Tilden houses. The property managers there for NYCHA will say that they're the worst buildings there. More tenants with more difficulties. The buildings are in worse condition than any of the others. And so we have been advancing and now have the cooperation of some of the critical agencies, this notion of doing a pilot, which is around building a new building and recladding and totally rethinking an existing building. In fact, this tower in Paris that you probably saw recently in the New York Times, sort of our inspiration. I felt like we should, send a gift basket to Michael Kimmelman at the Times for highlighting it. But they did something in Paris that we've been talking about doing in Brownsville, taking a very ordinary, kind of oppressive brick building and recladding it. And so this is kind of the governing idea for Brownsville now as a pilot site. This is the site. There's a subway stop right there. Gateway site, of course, it's a parking lot. It's also pretty dangerous. There's a number of shootings at this corner. So for a variety of reasons, it's a very good place to begin. And we just came back from being part of the American Architecture Foundation's Sustainable Cities Design Competition, where they selected this project, and we were able to, with the city agencies and with designers from different parts of the country, create a sort of a set of short-term objectives about what needed to happen to get that site rezoned, replanned, a system in place that NYCHA could sign off on for the recladding, and do this all, at least get the requests for proposals out the door and awarded before Mayor Bloomberg's term of office ends. And one of the most exciting things that came out of this kind of intense concentration with designers and very much on the sustainability theme was, what if you were to take this large cluster of public housing and these block after block, and the fact that it's owned by one landlord, and actually think about creating a different kind of environment. So we're also beginning to look at, could we create a whole sort of wetland system, and by introducing this notion of really making the whole surrounding campus of the NYCHA sites part of a stormwater treatment system. And in the meantime, we're doing a lot with that site in terms of interim uses, from youth markets to jazz concerts to community meetings, where we just bring out tables and chairs and have community meetings. And then just to end on the theme of, it's not about the buildings alone, but as we learned, it's about the people. We've just been focusing on organizing the people. We've got about 30 different organizations, local and government and not-for-profits we've recruited in to join us in our work who have complementary expertise, and we figure it's sometimes the connection points between organizations and people and the help they need that have failed. It's not that the help isn't there, it's just not connected strongly and in a targeted way. And so we're working on an interesting model of just kind of networked approaches to community development. And so at the end of the day, we hope to move from this, which is the existing environment, to something that is much more knit together, sustainable, and much more of the kind of community any of us would like to live in.